Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today, I return to a rather less horrible episode. Episodes where my guest and I determine that the politician under scrutiny doesn't deserve to be among the likes of Bashar al-Assad or Lukashenko. Anyone interested in world politics in 2022 needs to know about events in Taiwan. And that's why today's subject is the current President of Taiwan, Tsai Ing Wen. Tsai has been president since 2016. A member of the Democratic Progressive Party, Tsai is in effect the leader of liberal Taiwan, with her party broadly promoting the idea of a Taiwanese identity. In doing so, she faces two opponents. Domestically, she faces the Kuomintang, or KMT, which seeks to reunify Taiwan with mainland China, after the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s split mainland China and Taiwan between communism and state capitalism, respectively. Tsai also, of course, faces mainland China, known as the People's Republic, which also seeks to reintegrate Taiwan into its authoritarian state. As part of any bilateral trade agreement, the People's Republic, now led by Xi Jinping, requires the partner country to recognise them as the sole China. Even the UN hasn't recognised Taiwan's legitimacy as a legal entity since 1971. This puts Tsai in a difficult position, as was recently seen when a visit to Taiwan by Speaker of the US House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi led to China conducting military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Just yesterday, American warships reportedly passed through the strait, demonstrating the risk of global conflict if China were to invade Taiwan. In spite of this, Tsai has built up a reputation as an unflappable technocrat, and nobody is under any illusions that a military takeover of Taiwan would be easy. My guest for this conversation today is Brian Hioe, editor of New Bloom magazine, an online publication covering activism and youth politics in Taiwan and the Asia-Pacific that was founded after the pro-democracy Sunflower Movement. As well as Tsai's career, we discuss the Taiwanese identity, the quality of democracy in Taiwan, and whether the KMT is acting as a Trojan horse for Beijing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Tsai Ing Wen. Hi Brian, how are you doing?
Pretty good. There's just been a typhoon in Taipei, but things are relatively okay. It's relatively mild, so it's not too bad actually.
Glad to hear it. Brian, we are discussing Tsai Ing Wen today. She has been the president of Taiwan since 2016. She was born in 1956. She's 66 now. Taiwan was a very young country at the time of her birth. For people who don't know much about the background of her country, what are the most important things to know, do you think, about Taiwan's formation? The things that make Taiwan a place, among other things, of such contestation today?
So, most often when you hear Taiwan in the news, it's regarding contestation between Taiwan and China. China claims Taiwan to be part of its integral territory. But when you examine the history, it's a little more complicated. So Taiwan's first inhabitants are indigenous, 2% indigenous, their descendants are 2% of the population today, rather. And then there are hundreds of waves of Han settlement after the kind of 1600s. And after that, then you have the Chinese Civil War, you have the KMT coming to Taiwan and bringing with individuals that are now, their descendants are 10% of the population. And so you have these different waves of migration to Taiwan from China. You also have the Japanese colonial period from 1895 to 1945. But then for China today, it claims as though it's all been a part of China. That Taiwan has always been part of China. It's always been this way. In reality, Taiwan was only incorporated into China under the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, which the PRC claims as part of its borders today, despite that it was one of the political forces that overthrew the Qing dynasty. But that's how we get this kind of contestation now between, for example, China and Taiwan today, which you hear in the news quite often.
Thank you. Tsai is notable because her educational background was fairly international. She studied at Cornell University in the United States and then at the London School of Economics. She's a lawyer by training. Is this international education a reflection of an upbringing within the Taiwanese elite?
Yeah, I would generally say so. I mean, I think that most presidents have had pretty high education. I mean, we had, for example, the two dictators, Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo, father and son. But in the presidents after that, they were all people that were highly educated from elite institutions. All of them went to National Taiwan University, for example, which is the leading university in Taiwan. Most have PhDs. For example, Tsai, Li Denghui, Ma Ying-jeou. The only president that does not is Chen Shui-bian, but he was still a law graduate from National Taiwan University, and at the time he was actually the youngest law graduate to pass the bar, became the youngest defense lawyer in Taiwan. So you'd have this general pattern of high education, of elite backgrounds with regards to education in that respect.
Taiwan today is different to the People's Republic of China in the sense that it's a democracy, and quite a strong one, actually. But it hasn't always been, which is something you've just alluded to. I mean, like in South Korea, which is another one of these kind of East Asian tiger economies, it transitioned to democracy. Taiwan only became a democracy in the 1980s. Tsai would have been in her 30s when the transition happened. Do you think, is democracy something she's always believed in? Do you think that she's displayed, let's say, the zeal of a convert, shall we say? You know, has she kind of warmed to democracy over time, or do you think she's a Democrat to her core?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, she is the second non-KMT president that has been democratically elected, but she has an interesting background. It's different from her predecessor, Chen Shui-bian, who seemed much more kind of ideological. Chen was harder line on independence, for example. Tsai was actually her original rise to power or into politics came as a trade negotiator under Li Denghui, she is in many ways the kind of protege of Li Denghui in the sense that he was someone that was in the KMT, but who was quote unquote ventured. That's to say, he's descended from the earlier waves of Han migration in Taiwan. And his appointment basically to position the power within the KMT took place at a time of rising identity in which the KMT had to appoint someone that was ventured because just all their leaders were people that had come from China in relatively recent terms. And Li Denghui, he got to the top, and it turned out his political views were completely different. He was actually much more pro-independence. And so since then, the KMT has always feared someone rising to the top in this way, and then kind of turning on the party. But Tsai was a trade negotiator under him, and that's how she entered politics. And she wasn't part of the DPP, for example. Chen Shui-bian was, her predecessor, DPP president, was actually one of the defense lawyers, for example, for political dissidents during the period. Whereas Tsai, it's a little less clear then, and she joins the DPP much later. It throws her hat into the race. I mean, she kind of rises to her position of power, despite not historically have been part of the DPP, because there was a kind of power vacuum. And so it's one of those things that's kind of unclear. But I think Tsai was maybe more pragmatic and less ideological. I mean, she was not really in the streets per se, in protests and so forth, but kind of rose through the administration as maybe attempting to be a reformer from the inside, similar to Li.
Most countries in the world either recognize the legitimacy of Taiwan or the People's Republic. It's worth noting that until the 1970s, most Western countries recognized Taiwan, whilst most of the kind of Eastern Bloc and a lot of the Third World non-aligned countries generally recognized the People's Republic. But this kind of changed in the 1970s. The US recognized the People's Republic then, so did Britain, Australia. Taiwan then became a democracy in the 1980s, as I said. Do you think that there's a link between those two phenomena? Do you think that between the shift away from the international community recognizing Taiwan and Taiwan becoming increasingly isolated, do you think that that spurred the democratic transition?
That's a very good question, actually. I mean, it's very hard to determine a single factor for the transition to democracy, but I think that the blow to legitimacy of the Chiang regime was a factor, and that includes the kind of pushing of Taiwan out of international institutions. Taiwan's democratization also takes place in the context of third-wave democratizations in Latin America or, for example, movements in South Korea and that sort of thing. And so it tends to take place in this larger global context. I mean, for example, some of the democracy movements, some of the discourse, particularly around the 1970s, was drawn from the international New Left. This kind of notions of self-determination were kind of in the air at that point in time. And so that was definitely in the ether. I think it does have a kind of blow to the Chiang regime's legitimacy. That is maybe one of the things that pushes for democratization. And I think what's also interesting is that Taiwan, I mean, under Tsai or anyone else, has often tried to position itself as that it should be allowed into the international community because it is progressive and it secures it should be allowed in because of the good things it does, such as legalizing gay marriage or housing indigenous on behalf of the ROC state. I mean, it's particularly visible at the Tsai. And so I think that that's another factor determining the kind of left-right stew of Taiwanese politics sometimes.
That sort of preempts my next question in a way. You've mentioned these two main political parties in Taiwan, the KMT and the DPP. Obviously, the KMT was integral in the founding of Taiwan, going back to the days of Chiang Kai-shek and the Civil War. I mean, the interesting thing is that obviously notions of Taiwanese self-identity are very important in your domestic politics.
Yes.
There's a question of whether the people on the island see themselves as being kind of at one with China, or whether there's this kind of separate, identifiable Taiwanese identity. How does this identity question inform your political parties, and where does Tsai stand on this?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question as well. So the official name of Taiwan is the ROC, that's the Republic of China. This was the government brought over to Taiwan by the KMT after its defeat to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in the Chinese Civil War. So that's officially the name of the country. And so the biggest split then between the KMT and the DPP has historically been regarding this independence unification question. The DPP is historically the party of pro-independence, and the KMT is historically the party of pro-unification. The KMT is also, of course, the former authoritarian party, while the DPP arises out of the democracy movement. And so their contestations along those lines. Both parties have drifted, though, from their kind of original messaging. The KMT, for example, it was literally defeated by the CCP in the Chinese Civil War. It's enemies with the CCP historically. But now there's been rapprochement, in which they're willing to facilitate the unification of Taiwan and China, even if it occurs under the CCP's auspices. It's a very interesting situation because the KMT historically was a right-wing authoritarian regime backed by the U.S. But then, for example, with democratization, the kind of political elite of the KMT lose a lot of their ruling privileges because you have democratization. They're able to kind of maintain this grip on power. And I also kind of wonder sometimes if they feel as though that having an external backer, they are trying to switch now from the U.S. to China. That if, for example, they're able to facilitate the unification of Taiwan and China under Chinese auspices, under the CCP's auspices, they can restore their privileges. But then the DPP, historically, when it was the opposition, it was much more strident on independence issues. But particularly now, it fears the loss of U.S. support. For example, Tsai had her presidential campaign in 2012 sabotaged with a phone call to the Financial Times from the White House. And so the DPP has backed away from being more pro-independence. Where Tsai herself stands on that is also a little unclear. I mean, she's actually been very good at being strategically ambiguous on the issue. That's to say, she took president and, she took the office and everyone's speculating, well, will she accept the 1992 consensus? Will she not accept it? And she says, I acknowledge the facts of the talks of the 1992, talks or something like that. And so everyone's like, what does this mean? And so then after that, she's drifted away from the kind of KMT's messaging as though Taiwan is always part of China, as though the two countries have an agreement that Taiwan is part of China. And so I think she's kind of done that, but also gradually inching towards a more kind of pro-sovereignty position.
Can you just underscore a bit what happened in 1992 for people listening?
Yeah, so the 1992 consensus refers to the so-called agreement that there is one China, but that Taiwan and China, or I would say the Republic of China and People's Republic of China, disagree on their interpretation of that. It's based on talks between Taiwanese and Chinese government officials. And it's quite interesting because if you look at the historical progression, those talks, the level at which they took place, have long been superseded, but people still talk about the 1992 consensus. There's also some speculation regarding whether this actually existed, whether this actually took place, or if it's the post-facto fabrication of the KMT, that they kind of made this up as a way to smooth over the democratic transition, the transition to power in 2000, that there was some kind of agreement between Taiwan and China, for example, that could maintain stable cross-strait relations. And so it's one of the things that gets thrown out then between China and Taiwan, where China claims, well, Taiwan, you're violating this now because you're not agreeing to this. If you just return to this, that's a stable bedrock of one of just peace in the cross straits. But the thing is, what's interesting is China has been much less emphatic on the respective interpretations part of the 1990 consensus and only the one China part. And so it's there's been kind of this shift as well regarding that.
It sounds like a classic case of we'll agree to disagree.
Yeah, that's right.
It's interesting, really, what you said about the KMT sort of perhaps trying to substitute the US for China, or rather China for the US, excuse me. I sort of assumed that obviously they would like to reintegrate with mainland China, but only if that happens on their own terms. It doesn't sound as if that's really the case.
Yeah, it's no longer the case. I think there's a very idealized view of the CCP. For example, that there's a view even that the CCP is democratized, for example, among some members of the KMT. You have former chairs of the KMT, for example, running off to China to go to Xinjiang and say that, well, nothing's happening here, everything is fine. China's counterterrorism efforts are actually quite great, that kind of thing. So I think they've kind of given up on that because it's militarily impossible. But I think also it's interesting in the way the DPP has been pushed into a odd position where we're in the U.S. as well. I mean, historically, the U.S. backed their enemy, the KMT, but now the DPP is allied with the U.S. as well because the U.S. is Taiwan's guarantor of security against China. And so there's a kind of odd situation. As I mentioned, for example, Chen Shui-bian was viewed as a pro-independence provocateur. The U.S. preferred, actually, the KMT, the former authoritarian party, returned to power in 2012. And so you have this attempt to sabotage Tsai, for example. So I don't think the DPP has forgotten that either, though they consciously deal with the U.S. and, at least publicly, will definitely try to attach themselves to the U.S.
If we look at Tsai's career in politics a bit more closely, as you mentioned, she was a trade negotiator during the 1990s, and she's been in kind of frontline politics for quite a long time now. And her first big role really was as mainland affairs minister, which is dealing with the so-called cross-strait policy with the People's Republic. She served between 2000 and 2004. In terms of how she personally dealt with the Chinese, what do you think her strategy was? And we begin to get into what she's actually like as a person here a bit more.
Totally. Yeah, I think what's interesting, I mean, I alluded to that she was strategically ambiguous regarding China. I mean, I think particularly when she was mainland affairs council, a lot would have to do with trade, just in terms of that Taiwan's economy is very reliant on China's economy. So, for example, one of the initiatives under her current administration is trying to decouple Taiwan from China so that it's not so reliant on China in that sense. I think it's one of those things in which during that period in time that you can't be as kind of pro-independent or there would not be as much kind of tension regarding cross-strait relations in which they would be fighting, or you'd have cases of Chinese being kidnapped by China within China, that kind of thing. And so I think that is much more muted. I mean, her career actually as the Mainland Affairs Council minister rarely gets brought up, and I think that's actually quite interesting. But it's a very interesting part of her portfolio that, for example, her dealings with cross-strait relations with China, then she chose to adopt this tactic in which she kind of basically stalled and was strategically ambiguous on her position, and then kind of dragged it out to have a kind of gradualist push for more space or more autonomy in terms of international affairs, or more attempts to kind of draw a line in terms of maintaining Taiwan's de facto independence. That approach, I think, is really developed through her dealings with China at that point in time. And I think it's also worth noting, though, that the China of that period was very different from today. That's to say that it's not as authoritarian. It seems like things are opening up. Economically, it's developing, that sort of thing.
Do you think that this time as mainland affairs minister was kind of the springboard for her running for the presidency? Do you think this made her sufficiently well known so that she could run?
I think not particularly. You don't really have as much presidents that their portfolio is built on being the Mainland Affairs Council. Like I said, in terms of the narrative, it's usually that she's a trade negotiator under Li Denghui. But the Li Denghui connection doesn't always get played up all the time either. For example, it's not like a thing that people say that, well, she's Li Denghui's protege, though she kind of is. I think part of that really does have to do with that. Li Denghui, despite his being remembered now as this kind of great figure in terms of Chinese democracy, he was actually the president, and he was the president of the KMT. And so he was someone that was actually literally on the KMT, but just a turncoat within the party that somehow got to the top. And sometimes I do wonder if that's even kind of post facto, that kind of remembrance of Li, that verdicts on Li shifted radically once he left office and become much more politically strident, but also kind of wonder if he was just going with the direction of the political wind in some ways. And so I think that in terms of Tsai, it's really because there was a power vacuum in the DPP when she comes to power in the kind of early 2010s. That is just because there's no other people that are willing to throw their hat to the race, and she is willing to. And so that actually leads to her taking power. And it's actually a little bit surprising that she has been able to out-manipulate kind of other political figures in the DPP that actually have longer histories in the party or records going back to, for example, pro-democracy activism. That's quite an interesting development.
As I mentioned, Taiwan became a democracy in the 1980s. If you think about elections there, how vibrant is the democracy, would you say, and what are the campaigns in Taiwan like?
Yeah, this is kind of one of those interesting things in which just the campaigns are like literally everywhere. And so I think particularly foreign observers would be surprised by how much ads there are for just campaigns everywhere. And so you really just go outside and see like the same person's face like literally on every billboard, or just like they have a banner hanging on every street. It's very all-consuming society. It's like this. It's even like a massive industry just to produce these posters or campaign goods or the vest that the kind of campaign workers wear. It's quite large. It's quite a raucous sometimes too, because you have these rallies being held. They're playing music, and you have musical performances and so forth. I mean, elections are definitely an interesting time. They're obviously a busy time for me as a reporter, but it's very interesting to observe. And you have very strange campaign ads, and you have candidates from both parties kind of fighting it over various issues and having strange attacks on each other, or securing endorsements too. And you have all them these pictures of them and other major figures. Like Tsai will appear in a lot of ads with other DPP politicians to lend her political weight to them and that kind of thing.
Is she raucous as a campaigner?
No, this is actually one of those really amusing things that she's a horrible public speaker, and so then you'll have her on this like rowdy campaign rally, and then it's like people like shouting and screaming, and there's like music performances, and she'll make a very like bland speech, or that she'll say something wrong. Like there's one time it's like, yeah, we need to defend the future of Taiwan for the sake of this ex-candidate's daughter, and then she says the name of the daughter wrong, and then the candidate has to awkwardly correct her, and it's very awkward. She's actually not a great public speaker, and so she's actually not too politically charismatic in the traditional sense of being able to like whip up a crowd into a frenzy and that sort of thing. He's really not able to do that. I think that is actually why she was able to get to kind of where she is in some ways, in the sense that, for example, winning the faith of the U.S., that she's not a pro-independence provocateur. It's because she's so moderate, and she can kind of downplay the kind of acceptability for China to direct threats at her administration because she is so moderate. And so I think that is actually to her advantage. But I mean, public speaking, it's actually particularly a matter of concern, I think, for her campaign during presidential debates, because she's not. I mean, she had a fame as a negotiator, but she's not a very good debater, and not very good at shouting people down. Or the points are very like policy based, not really like ideological, and so that's not always the best kind of debating style either. It's quite funny to watch her do public speeches during these campaign rallies, though.
Underneath the quite febrile campaigning in Taiwan, would you say that sort of elections are fairly substantive and kind of debates surrounding, are there like proper debates surrounding policy? I mean, it's something that we constantly lament in Britain and the States now is the kind of lack of substantive debate during policy debate during election campaigns.
Yeah, it really depends on which election year. I think oftentimes, some years you need to have much more debates about policy. For example, because there's a national referendum system. So if there's an issue that's being up for national referendum, like gay marriage or, an energy plant or, for example, an LNG terminal, that kind of thing, then that might be debated. But oftentimes it actually just boils down to party ID between the KMT and the DPP, because fundamentally these two parties are existentially at odds. One is pro-China, pro-unification, the other is pro-independence, pro-Taiwan. And so they have two different visions of what country even they think that they are representing, or that they think the future of Taiwan should go in the direction of more towards independence or more towards China. And so they're fundamentally at odds, and oftentimes they are fighting each other on that basis then. So, for example, the DPP will bring up issues like Hong Kong or, for example, in past years, to avoid actually discussing domestic policy, saying, well, if you have the KMT, look at their presidential candidate. He was just meeting with the leader of Hong Kong and shaking hands, saying that we need closer ties and trade ties and so forth. If you vote for him, we'll end up like Hong Kong. And so that's a way to actually avoid talking about domestic policy. You don't actually have to fight it out with KMT over domestic policy. You just kind of push everything back to cross-strait issues. The KMT is basically doing the same thing, too, in the sense that it says that, well, we're the only party that can maintain stable cross-strait relations. If you vote for the DPP, that's going to make the situation more dangerous, so don't vote for them. But then you don't actually have substantive debate in politics. I think a lot is very personality-based regarding candidates. It's very much like, do people like this candidate, or what's their sense of this candidate's reputation or the public image they convey, and that sort of thing. And so you have candidates doing things to kind of really craft their image, and that is not really a debate regarding policy.
She was kind of sufficiently well known by 2012 to be elected by the DPP to run for president. She's run for president 3 times. She lost in 2012, and then she won
that's right.
the 2 elections after. What changed between 2012 and 2016 that meant that Tsai lost to the KMT in 2012, but then won the presidency in 2016?
So I think, for example, if you look at the timing, Xi Jinping takes power in 2012, the Chinese president. And so you have this kind of downturn in which all the gains of the previous years in terms of opening up for democratic freedoms are just reversed. So that's one factor. But then there's the increasing backlash against the KMT that erupted in the form of the 2014 Sunflower Movement, which was a student-led movement that involved the month-long occupation of the Taiwanese legislature in protest of their free trade agreement that was to be signed with China that would allow for investment in Taiwan's service sector industry. And so this was a movement that, for example, I was a participant in. It was a kind of generational moment for many Taiwanese young people. It's one of the largest social movements in Taiwanese history. And so I think that a lot of people looked only at elections and felt as though the KMT was kind of in power for good. But that turned out not to be the case. Its footing was actually on very unstable grounds. There was a lot of backlash against what was viewed as resurgent authoritarianism of the KMT. For example, attempting to whitewash its history, changing textbooks so that would not really discuss the kind of crimes committed by the KMT during the authoritarian period. Or, for example, just that when Chinese officials come to Taiwan, you just kind of remove all things that are kind of indicating Taiwanese-ness, like flags, or some people not play songs that are spoken in Taiwanese when the Chinese officials passing by. And that just didn't really go well with the public because the democracy was hard fought for. And so having the kind of former authoritarian party back in power doing these things provoked people. And the way the trade deal was passed too, it circumvented the committee. This person that was the head of the committee just announced it passed using a megaphone while hiding in a bathroom to avoid protests. And so that did not play well with the public. And Ma was also seeking to expel people from within the KMT that he viewed as opposed to his power, that's to say, that were more pro-Taiwan or people that he thought could potentially be another Li Denghui. And so that is really what changes, and that is what Tsai really rises to power on the basis of. For example, then she really manages to turn the DPP's reputation around as a party that is viewed as kind of more stodgy, older opposition into a party that appears as though it has the support of young people. And so she really managed to do that. And so outreach efforts to young politicians, political ads that have a very kind of young directed aesthetic. They got one of the well-known designers that was part of the Sunflower Movement and did a lot of the kind of aesthetic work, crafting the aesthetics of the movement to do the design for her campaign, for example. A lot of campaign ads would then gesture towards what young people, kind of the issues they cared about regarding the environment or LGBTQ issues or indigenous issues or regarding new immigrants to Taiwan, cultural pluralism, that sort of thing. And so she is able to actually really kind of ride that wave to power and has done so since.
In terms of that aesthetic of being like a young party, is that borne out in election results? Do young people generally vote for the DPP now and older people generally vote for the KMT, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
Regarding the older people, it's much more complicated because you do fundamentally have the identity split between people that are descended from those that came with the KMT and those that are from prior waves of migration. And those that came with the KMT, that's like 10% of the population, it's a minority. And so there's that. Young people, though, they do overwhelmingly vote for the DPP. The KMT has an issue in which it has very little young people within the party. 2 years ago, it had less than 9,000 members that are under 40. And so that's kind of dire straits to the party. It has some younger politicians, but it doesn't have as much as the DPP. And just all the campaign workers in the DPP are often young people. And so that's very visible in terms of, it filters into other parts of election campaigning. Just like, for example, the KMT ads often are just like horrifically designed. It's like people that don't know how to use Photoshop. And the DPP ads are much more higher quality in terms of graphic design. And I think that just reflects how much young people there are in the party. The KMT keeps doing these things to try to appeal to younger people, and people just find it really cringeworthy. Like, there's one time in which two candidates got roasted because they were wearing like grandfather pants that were up to their like elbows in like a ad or something like that. And so that is another, I think, difference between the two parties.
One of the things that is worth noting is that Tsai, as president, has presided over sort of liberal social reforms in Taiwan. The things like you mentioned, same-sex marriage, which is now legal in Taiwan, which is very rare for East Asia. Does she see liberal social policy as being central to this Taiwanese identity, or is that the way the DPP sees it, do you think?
It's a really good question. I mean, the DPP historically did actually have a left-wing basis. That's why there's progressive in the party. It did have ties to the labor movement, for example, in the period of democratization. But then also there are very conservative aspects of the party that are, for example, very anti-gay, very anti-feminist, for example. Because fundamentally the party was a alliance against the KMT. And so basically all these different political views kind of came together in this alliance group because they opposed the KMT. I mean, there's even a joke by a political scientist that democracy, the people that were conservative wanted democracy in the name, people that are more left-wing want progressive in the name. So that's why you have Democratic Progressive Party. And there's that, but there's this history. But then at the same time, I really think the DPP rebranding as kind of the party of progress or of liberal reforms is because it really wanted to ride this wave of progressive young people after the Sunflower Movement. Tsai herself is kind of a colorless technocrat in many ways. She's not someone that has very particularly strong ideological views. But then because this is the way the political direction is going, I mean, that's the way the DPP therefore leans. And so it did a pretty good job in terms of just changing its image around in that sense. Because, for example, even during the Sunflower Movement, there's a lot of backlash against the DPP with the view that during the 10 years it had grown corrupt, that it had many politicians that were involved in corruption scandals, similar to the KMT, that had become not so different from the KMT, in fact. But then after the movement, the DPP just kind of radically changed its image around. And I do think Tsai had a major role in that. It's not necessarily because of her own views per se, because of her political savvy and knowing that this is where the direction of the wind is going. And so therefore we have to accommodate that. That's maybe something that she shares with Lee, who she does seem to be the protege of. And so I think that's kind of one of her accomplishments in that sense, that she was able to kind of rebrand the DPP in this way.
One of the most important events of her presidency has been the pandemic. What do you think the balance sheet looks like for Taiwan in terms of how it dealt with the pandemic? It seems, from somebody who, I mean, obviously this was a completely global thing and it's hard to keep track of how different countries are doing, but it seems like Taiwan, considering its proximity to China, did pretty well. Yeah,
that's right. So Taiwan was kept COVID-free for more than a year, in which basically life just proceeded as normal and things were quite stable, because there was very quick action by the government to, for example, just isolate cases, to set up a QR code system in which you, for example, would kind of get down what place you had been, so that allows for contact tracing and so forth. And so that's to Tsai's credit and of her Ministry of Health and Welfare. For example, I think that if it had been a different administration, probably it would not have been as accomplished in terms of just dealing with that. I mean, later on, Taiwan did see outbreaks. Those were contained relatively quickly, and Taiwan then eventually transitioned away from COVID-0, which was also something that became a political blow to Tsai because people were so used to COVID-0. But then it was still done relatively well. And so I think that is one of those things, that Tsai is a very able technocrat. And so a lot of the kind of aspects of policy or adjustments, she's very attentive to that. And so I think that kind of worked out well in that sense. Sometimes I kind of wonder about the scenario in which the KMT candidate of 2020, who's this kind of like right-wing populist that does not seem to be very particularly effective in government and is often like taking days off because he's hungover and that kind of thing. If he had been elected, I don't think we would have this outcome. But yeah, I think it's definitely to her credit. But it's interesting, there's still political infighting, and the KMT will still try to snipe at Tsai's record regarding that. A lot of the claims that they embrace are kind of not factual. For example, they'll say that Taiwan had issues purchasing vaccines, and this is particularly a failure of Tsai's, that she was not able to purchase vaccines, that her administration did not have any interest in doing that. And it's not actually the case, because it just happens that outside of the first world countries, those countries that are not major first world countries receive vaccines slower than those first world countries that are very powerful in the world. And it's also the case that, for example, vaccine purchases are negotiated by just pharmaceutical companies directly with the governments. It's not the case that, for example, private civilians can negotiate these things. And so this is already in the hands of the government. And so the KMT would kind of allege, well, this is not normal, actually. Why are you negotiating with the government only? But that's actually just standard practice, which also reflects the major power pharmaceuticals in the world. But that's another story.
I want to spend the rest of the interview discussing what's happened these last few weeks. Obviously, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan about a month ago. Mike Pompeo is due to make his second trip to Taiwan this year over the next few weeks, I think. And this has resulted in a less than happy response, let's say, from the People's Republic with military exercises in the Strait. Tsai is president, obviously, which is an outward-facing role. She's the person who deals with international figures. Are these trips something you can put down to Tsai directly? What does she think of Pelosi visiting and Pompeo and people like that?
So I think it's quite interesting there. It's a very interesting dynamic. For example, for the DPP, the Pelosi visit or visits by U.S. government politicians can be touted as domestic accomplishments, that they improved U.S.-China or U.S.-Taiwan ties, to the extent that you have these visits from U.S. politicians. At the same time, then it does invite reprisals from China. I think it's important to note that there's not the kind of panic in Taiwan that there was in the international world. People were relatively chill about it because of the fact that there have been Chinese threats directed at Taiwan for so long. This is not anything particularly new. People are rather inured to it. But in this sense, actually, the question is, could Taiwan actually say no to these visits? And I think right now, not particularly. There were some news reports, for example, that the Tsai administration had tried to disinvite Pelosi, fearing that this would escalate tensions in the region, but that it was overruled. And so is there actually this capacity to say no? That's actually a good question. And so I think privately what goes on and what the DPP talks about behind closed doors, that's a very good question, actually. But at least publicly, they will always be, well, we will roll out the red carpet, or we very welcome this and that kind of thing. It does create for awkward bedfellows. It also creates some awkward situations. I mean, for example, Marsha Blackburn, the very pro-Trump administration U.S. government, U.S. Congresswoman, came to Taiwan, for example, and she posed in front of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial and took a photo and praised Chiang Kai-shek in a tweet. But then this takes place at the same time in which the debate is whether to get rid of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial because the DPP is viewed as a monument to authoritarianism.
In terms of where China is now in its position on Taiwan, you've obviously had these demonstrations in the military exercises conducted in the Straits. I don't think there's much doubt that the PRC wants to integrate Taiwan. But if it were to do so, how do you think that would happen? I mean, there's obviously kind of two routes that could be taken here. You've got the sort of military takeover of it, or a kind of takeover by stealth in terms of what's happened in Hong Kong. You've alluded to this idea that the KMT has become more favourable to the CCP. Yeah. Do you think that actually it might be more likely, everybody's obviously concerned about the military outcome at the moment, but do you think that the more likely scenario might be that the KMT acts as a kind of Trojan horse for the CCP within Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, that's already doing so in many ways. For example, just right after the visit, the KMT sent its vice chair to meet with Chinese government officials. And it's known that there's probably communication behind the scenes. Sometimes there's always questioning about whether acts by the CCP are meant to politically benefit the KMT in terms of elections. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. And so there's definitely that big concern. And for example, that's why there was the Sunflower Movement in 2014 regarding a trade deal that the KMT was trying to advance with China. With regard to Hong Kong, I mean, that is because there was a treaty with the Sino-British agreement to return Hong Kong from British control to Chinese control. And so although the claim is that Hong Kong's political system will remain unchanged for 50 years, changes start happening much sooner. And so there's that. But then there's also within Taiwan, I mean, for example, the effects of the Chinese economy, economic influence, you would have publications self-censoring, for example, because they're also operating in the Chinese market, or business is self-censoring. You also do have pro-China businessmen that are affiliated with KMT, for example, seeking to buy Chinese media, Chinese language media outlets in Taiwan in order to advance pro-China views. And so there's already that concern about influence. So I think both scenarios are happening at once in that sense.
I don't think there's any doubt that the Chinese would favour a non-military reintegration of Taiwan. It just obviously be easier. But say if that doesn't work, or if the kind of slow-moving reintegration doesn't happen, do you think that Xi Jinping, who is actually going to be the subject of an episode I'm doing in about a month, do you think that he actually would conduct a military takeover of Taiwan? Do you think this is a likely scenario under his presidency?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I don't think in the short term, because China lacks the basic capacity for example, transporting enough troops to Taiwan to maintain a long-term occupation, lift capacity, just having enough boats. But then, on the other hand, for example, if you conduct invasion, that means tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of lives lost in a costly invasion. The economic impact would be enormous. Taiwan's economy is large enough that would lead to global impact. China's economy is already large too, obviously, and the two are tightly integrated, and this is connected to all over the world regarding semiconductors, regarding manufacturing, etc. And so it really depends. I mean, if Xi goes ahead with this would perhaps actually precipitate a crisis within China, and he might not be able to maintain his grip on power if that were the case. But perhaps to expand powers, he might want to precipitate a crisis, to cause a crisis, so that's to justify expanding powers. And so one of the easier ways to do so is to go after Taiwan. I don't think we're looking at full-scale invasion yet. I think oftentimes it's a bit misleading that we discuss it in terms of all or nothing, as though invasion, it's full-on invasion or nothing at all. When in reality, there are a lot of intermediate scenarios, such as a blockade, attacking one of Taiwan's outlying islands, gray zone tactics, and that sort of thing. And so it's possible to see something in between. But I think it really does depend. It depends on, for example, I mean, it's not a rational move to invade Taiwan, because this is also then a cost in terms of lives. The economic impact is huge. But also you have to maintain a long-term occupation in which there is probably going to be resistance. It's also very difficult to do. And so does China want to deal with that? Integrating a population that was previously democratic, that large, is also going to create issues. And so it's a question. But if oftentimes I think the interests of leaders are not the same as of the people. So I think that's the case with the Chinese leadership as well. And particularly then, having an invasion might be a way to expand power, but even if it does cause this enormous kind of loss of life and economic fallout.
even before that hypothetical fallout as a result of the invasion, I mean, China is already suffering mounting problems. Economic growth is slowing due to the zero COVID policy. It's got an aging population. It's got various ecological crises. Do those internal problems that exist already inside China, do you think it makes you more or less worried about the prospect of an invasion of Taiwan?
Actually, it's one of those things that cuts both ways. Like, for example, China having all this stuff on its plate, that's maybe one reason not to invade Taiwan. But then perhaps if you want to distract from those domestic failings and pin the blame elsewhere, perhaps that is a good reason then to invade Taiwan if you're the Chinese leadership. And so I think it's actually kind of, it's both sides. And so it's actually very hard to judge there.
And how likely is it, do you think, that the US would come to Taiwan's aid if a move were to be made?
It's really hard to say. I mean, it's a very hard to know in that situation. I think the U.S. would be reluctant to get involved in many ways because just, having the casualties, having all these foreign interventions that provoke blowback, and so forth. But economically, the U.S. is also very reliant on Taiwan. And so I think it really does come down to it. I think it's more likely, to be honest, that intermediate powers in the region would become involved because shipping routes in the region pass through near Taiwan. And so they would be affected as well.
Do you think it depends at all on which party controls the White House?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, Taiwan historically has been much more skeptical of the Democrats, particularly, for example, I just alluded to Tsai being sabotaged in her run. I mean, that occurred under Obama, for example. Or is the view that, for example, the Democrats were interested in building economic ties with China, whereas Republicans are more hawkish on China. And so there's those concerns. But I actually think that right now, I mean, the Pelosi visit is framed as bipartisan by Pelosi very deliberately. I think it's very much a bipartisan consensus. So I think this does not actually really differ between the two parties currently.
Yes, I mean, as I said a second ago, Pompeo is about to go to Taiwan anyway. I mean, I just have a couple more questions for you. The overlap between the Ukraine crisis and the current Taiwan issue has been quite interesting to watch. Many people have attempted to link the two of them.
Yeah.
Do you think it's useful to link the two of them? I mean, if it were useful, if it were relevant, it would sort of suggest that between China and Russia, there is a burgeoning alliance that's attempting to sort of reshape the global order. It's also entirely plausible, of course, that these two events are just unrelated and are simply being compared to one another because they are happening at the same time as one another. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, for example, the notion of Russia and China alignment on the issue is a bit overstated because of the fact that if you go back and look at the messaging, I mean, China was actually put in a very inconvenient place by the invasion in terms of its own kind of attempts to build up international credibility, but then eventually did align with Russia. Then regarding, I think just because of the fact that there's a fear that Taiwan could be the next flashpoint, that's why there's this comparison. I mean, there are aspects that do align. For example, the way that Russia has culturally claimed that Ukraine has no independence or linguistically and culturally is indistinct from Russia and that is just part of Russia or that is created by just the Bolsheviks and that sort of thing. You see similar argumentation from China regarding Taiwan. At the same time, then, I think, for example, regarding the military scenario, I mean, a land-based invasion is very different from defending an island. And so that's fundamentally quite different. So the comparisons do help in that respect, I mean, in terms of ideology or overall framework, but I think in terms of the kind of concrete logistical aspects, maybe not necessarily.
Finally, then, to return to Tsai, she's been president for 6 years. She's got 2 more years to go, I think. The president is term limited. What's next for her? What does life hold for Tsai Ing Wen after her presidency?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that particularly she will continue to be a powerful figure in the DPP because factually, the DPP, I mean, her faction is still a large chunk of it. And so I think behind the scenes, she might still play the role of a kingmaker in some ways. It depends on really how active she is in the party then. There's not a lot of precedence for what presidents do after they retire in Taiwan, basically, because there's only literally been, like 4 democratically elected ones. And so some remain active in political life. Ma Ying-jeou, I mean, her predecessor, the KMT president, he's still quite active in the KMT. He's still a major force in the KMT. And so I think that might be a model in some sense.
Brian, thank you very much. That was a really interesting conversation, very wide-ranging. I think we managed to get a lot in. If people want to find out more about what you write and think and about Taiwan and do in Taiwan, where can they go?
So you can follow me on Twitter, for example, or just look me up on social media. And I also run New Bloom magazine. So that's new, like N-E-W, Bloom, B-L-O-O-M magazine. And you can also find that on social media. So that's a publication I founded in 2014 with friends after the 2014 Sunflower Movement.
Brian, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.